what will become the boundaries of the African states. But the Berlin Conference was motivated by a more imperialist perspective from Bismarck at that time, because he has to make sure that his country continued to be a leading one in Europe. So he used Africa as a faire valoir to promote a kind of hegemonic perspective. But anyway, this conference led to what we call the Balkanization of Africa. And this experience, and the third aspect, will lead to the decolonization and independence, in the sense that the modern African state will be designed around an exogenous approach of state building. And I give you this historical background because you can easily understand why a modern African state follows a very artificial perspective, because they've been drowned without the commitment of African leaders. And it's important here to keep in mind that during the Berlin Conference, for example, no African leader were invited. It was a conference organized by the colonial powers to deal with African issues without involve African people. So this specific experience led to the emergence of so-called artificial legal entities in Africa, to the point where some political scientists stated that African state is neither a state nor African. And here I refer to the work of Pierre Englebert. So you can see that the colonial experience is something very important to understand what we have today as a modern African state, and how in Africa you have these actors trying to be main player at the global level. So here you have a map of the African continent. The green part is sub-Saharan Africa, comprised of the majority of the African countries. Sometimes we call this part the Black Africa, and the rest is the Maghreb part of the continent. So indeed, Africa faces complex security challenges. And here I have to mention also the asymmetric and hybrid threats, such as Boko Haram. I don't know if you hear about this terrorist group in West Africa, which challenged a lot security and stability. You have also Al-Shabaab in the east of Africa, but you also have very specific security challenges around the Ebola pandemics that I consider as an insecurity challenge. And you have, of course, several civil wars. Following a Weberian definition of a state that I'm sure you know, this situation of instability expressed the incapacity of many African states to keep what Weber called the monopoly of the use of legitimate force. But also you can see how in this region, states are in a difficult situation to take on their sovereign duties. A state is supposed to provide duties to his population, access to health, access to education and security, etc. Then what are key security and challenges today in contemporary Africa, and how development perspective can help to better understand these challenges? And what are root causes of civil conflicts in modern African states, and to what extent and regional organizations such as African Union or the REX can provide what is called African solution to African security challenges. So this is the main question I would like to address with you this morning, but I hope that I will make my talk quite available for you. And let me start with what I consider as the key security challenges today in Africa. The most common security challenge is civil war, and classified by international law as a non-international armed conflict. You know probably the definition of this type of conflictuality. As I mentioned previously, the number of African armed conflict increased in the third decades after independence because of this specific history of African state that I explained to you. And you will see a spike in 1990s where the conflictuality in Africa became very high. And some area scholars explain this situation by the fact that during the Cold War, there was a kind, and I use here some explanation, there was a kind of freeze of antagonism on the continent between the West, especially United States and its allies, and the East, Soviet Union and other communist countries. So the Cold War has been a period where in Africa antagonism and the conflict dynamics were freezed. But at the end of the Cold War, we noticed that civil wars became more and more terrific on the ground due to this change in period of the international system. African conflictuality is often analyzed with identity and economic lenses in terms of ethnic or religious violence which occur within a state. These facts, and you probably hear in the literature how people consider civil war in Africa as barbaric, ethnic conflict, and always portray Africa and African countries as a place of barbarism and these negative stereotypes. These factors are relevant to understand conflict dynamics, security challenges in Africa, but it's crucial to have a broad perspective to better understand security challenges in the continent, not only to focus on this aspect. Ethnic and religious dimension actually play a critical role. As I mentioned, for example, Rwanda genocide has been fueled by a devastating ethnic mobilization. I'm sure you heard about this sad history, this sad experience in Africa. However, it's very important to keep in mind that the multicultural and multi-ethnic dimension of African states doesn't per se produce violent conflicts. People from Africa, because of this multiculturalism, are not conflict prone, but rather it's the negative use by some political elites by these identity differences which generate conflict dynamics. So here you have to be very nuanced when you come to analyze the conflict dynamics. For example, the concept of ivoirité in Côte d'Ivoire, which is a West African country, is a good example on how elites can exacerbate identity differences by making a discourse around identity. And you can see that what is the real motivation of this elite is to achieve political objective. And in Cote d'Ivoire, what happened is that some political elites use this concept of ivoirité to exclude other political leaders in the country. And then you will see how they develop a discourse around who is an authentic citizen of Cote d'Ivoire and who is not. But for many decades, Cote d'Ivoire was a peaceful and successful West African country with an diverse identity and multicultural groups, and they never had any issue. But because of the use of identity discourse by some political elite, then Cote d'Ivoire experienced a very devastating civil war in 2000. And Jack Snyder analyzed this dynamics as a kind of ethno-nationalism doctrine. It's a sort of political configuration based on the notion of autochthony. And here I don't have enough time to develop, but basically the idea of autochthony in social science is around who is the real citizen, the first one, and who are the newcomer. And this concept of autochthony versus allochthony is very critical to understand an identity conflict on the ground. That's the sine qua non condition to build peaceful and stable modern African states here, of course, in addition to strengthen the state apparatus, to my point of view, is to increase the legitimacy as a shared democratic value, which means that it's important to have political leaders elected on their projects, their capabilities, in a fair democratic exercise, not because of their identity belonging to a group or another one, but because they have a project for the country. So this idea is very important, because if you don't look at, if you don't care about legitimacy and open game in terms of election, then you have situations such as Cote d'Ivoire. Now, let me emphasize on another key security challenge related to identity discourse, which is what I call the emergence of regional system of war. Here, the international humanitarian law classifies this dynamic as the internationalization of an internal armed conflict. If I give you the example of West Africa, you will see that in 1990s, what I call this regional system of war appeared following identity community lines beyond national state borders. Remember what I explained to you about the Berlin Conference and the way African states have been designed. I can give you a concrete example. I'm native from Benin in West Africa. But if you come in West Africa, you will find people in Benin, in Togo, in Nigeria, in Ghana, from the same identity group, the same ethnic group. But because of the Berlin Conference, because of the colonial experience, and after independence, you will have from the same identity group people who became Beninese citizen, Togolese citizen, Ghanaian citizen, Nigerian citizen. So this fragmentation is a product of the colonial experience. In that context, when you have a civil war somewhere and you have a political violence or a conflict in a country, due to this transnational solidarity links to the experience of colonization, you will find people from neighboring country interfering in a national conflict situation. And then you will see the emergence of a regional system of war. And this is what happened. Michel Galli called this a warrior nomadism, which means that due to the inter-twin relations between people and population and communities, there is a solidarity. If you have a civil war in Côte d'Ivoire, then you can find people from neighboring countries coming to support their brothers belonging to a specific identity groups. And then you will notice the rise of a system of conflict. So basically, and if you want to understand civil war, which happened in Sierra Leone in 1991, you have to make the link with the civil war which happened in Liberia a few years ago. And likewise, if you want to understand the civil war which happened in Cote d'Ivoire in 2000, you should look at the connection with the Sierra Leone civil war. This regional system of war is something very important to understand conflict dynamics on the ground, because we have a transnational circulation of conflict dynamics, which often follows intertwined links between communities in the region. Therefore, it's very important to adopt a systemic approach when you want to analyze security challenges in Africa. Don't focus only at a state level, because dynamics on the ground are very complex, and then you need to have a big picture by looking at a systemic perspective. So here you have a map of on West Africa, where Liberia is what I call the epicenter of the conflictuality in the region. And you will find a link between Liberia, next please, Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea, Sierra Leone. And today, if you look at the situation in Mali, you can easily make the link with the previous civil wars which happens in this region. So a need to have really a systemic perspective. And I will now end by look at state level, and because I would like also to keep time for your questions and to interact also with my colleagues. And at state level, I will probably emphasize on one tool to understand conflict and security dynamics, which is the concept of horizontal inequalities. In all societies, you have vertical inequalities, which is that a medical doctor has a better situation than a nurse. A lawyer has probably a social better situation than someone who works in a supermarket. This is vertical inequality. You have it everywhere around the world. But horizontal inequalities are inequalities which follow the line of identity groups within a multicultural society, which means that when you experience horizontal inequalities, it's not because you are not capable, it's not because you are not well trained, but it's because you belong to an identity group which is excluded by the national system. And here you have 4 types of horizontal inequalities that I will briefly explain to you. You have economic horizontal inequalities, which are related to, for example, access to land, job opportunities. In many African countries, agriculture is key. But when you are not part of the strongest identity group, or the identity group of the president of the country, you can experience these economic horizontal inequalities, because you will be excluded to have access to lands. And it's the same issue about access to job opportunity. If in a multicultural country, the president is from the north of the country, I give you the example of Côte d'Ivoire, and you are from the south, because of this configuration, you are excluded, not because you are not capable, you are not well educated, but because of these horizontal inequalities. You have the same in terms of social horizontal inequalities. You have, for example, the issue of access to health, access to housing. You have the same in terms of political horizontal inequalities, and you cannot access to top level position in a country, not because you are not well educated, but because of the president is from the West, and then he promoted and he recruit at top position people from this part of the country. And the last aspect of horizontal inequality is the cultural horizontal inequality, which is something very critical because it's about the exclusion of specific cultural tradition. Can you imagine that for the National Day, I give you the example of Benin, my native country, because the president of the current one is from the south. For the National Independence Day, he promoted only traditional music or cultural things from the South and then excluded others from the North. These type of inequalities at national level used to produce conflict dynamics and become something very critical in terms of security challenge. And it's well documented in the literature that horizontal inequalities are conflict prone, especially in a context of structural violence and fragmented environment. And consequently, this type of inequality remain a key challenge in many African countries. Because remember that all African countries are multicultural. You will find nowhere in Africa a country with only one identity composition. Everywhere you have a multicultural and multi-ethnic configuration. So if you are in a such context, and if the state apparatus produce these horizontal inequalities, then it can be a conflict prone because some part of the national community will feel excluded from what Montesquieu called the civitas. And the state is supposed to be the place where everybody has the right, the same right, and also can exist per se. So let me conclude by emphasize on how security challenges are very complex in Africa, complex and fluid. You can see the fluidity here due to the multicultural configuration. And these challenges ranging from civil war to what I call structural violence, such as Ebola pandemics, or sometimes you have situations of starvation, which, as Johan Galtoun explained, are key challenge in terms of security. How can you imagine people in a small village where they don't have access to food, to clean water, in a country where they have some elites in other parts who enjoyed national resources. So here we are in a context where security challenges are very complex and fluid. For example, health pandemics represent a fundamental obstacle to socio-economic development. If you cannot have access to health, then how can you enjoy your right as a citizen of a country? And this situation leads to what we call in our discipline hybrid or asymmetric traits, because the nature of violence and of insecurity is very changing it's not only about wars, about this great approach. You have also on all these challenges related to what we call human security, but what Galton call structural violence. In a context where people uh, have no access to health, they are desperate. They can join a rebel group because they have no perspective. The complexity here is that sometimes these structural violence can be caused and consequence. If you don't have access to health, you can join a rebel group. And then if you start a civil war, this situation can produce an insecurity. This is why I talked about this fluidity, but also the fragmented nature of these challenges. Therefore, the African Union and other regional organizations right to promote a very broad perspective to deal with this security, because development is something very key. If you want to deal with security challenges in that context, in African context, you have to work on development. And in the Agenda 2063, which is the African Union's guideline, it is something like the United Nations Agenda 2030. The African Union has this Agenda 2063. And in this agenda, the African Union, which is a continental organization, is promoting a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development, an Africa of good governance, democracy, respect of human rights, justice, and rule of law, and an Africa whose development is people-driven. It's very important. People-driven, which means that we work for people. The target is people, not elites, not a small part of the group, but people-driven, and a policy very focused on women and youth. You know that Africa is a continent with a large part of youth. And for the coming decades, you will have more than half of African population less than 25 years old. So youth is an opportunity, but youth can be a challenge if we don't have this people-driven perspective with sustainable development policies to provide job, to provide access to health, education to these young population. So by doing so, the African Union is aimed to build a strong and resilient Africa, because this is a challenge, and ultimately achieve this Pan-African project. You hear about Pan-Africanism, but this Pan-African project based on the integration of people, because today the key challenge is to work to promote integration of people and to focus on all energy and to dedicate all energy for people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Deguila, for an amazing conference. I mean, it's very interesting, and the different way that African Union or the African country is very different for us, even if we are in the global south, right? So please, Professor Gasquez, well, let me introduce you. He's an associate professor in the International Relations Center at the Political and Social Science Faculty at the UNAM. Well, he has his PhD for International Relations and African Studies by the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. and he also have a master in political and social studies in the Institute of Political Studies in Paris. So please, your comments, Professor Gasquez.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. Thanks a lot for this presentation, Eric. It's very illuminating about African issues, mostly about the origin of the African state and problems regarding the state building with reference to the colonial period. I like a lot in my courses to refer to this period because this period, in my opinion, explains a lot of current issues still going on in Africa. Most importantly, in this dimension of this state fragility and the vulnerability of their societies. I would like also only to make like two points about your presentation. Is that recently I was listening at the news that, well, Africa is always a continent where countries are in a permanent state of like agitation. It's very dynamic. And lately in the news, I've been watching that there's a lot of political mobilization in countries like Algeria, even in countries like your home country in Benin, and also in Democratic Republic of Congo. Also, some examples of countries that are going through political processes of like elections. Yes, and in these elections, I have the impression that there's a lot of young people involved in protest, in mobilization. So I would like to ask you first if you think that even though these structural problems of African states, is it possible to affirm that there is some kind of that if that liberal citizenship is under construction with a lot of problems, obviously. But if we are finally making like a transition from this cultural citizenship or ethnic citizenship or religious citizenship to a framework of a real and substantial liberal citizenship. This is my first question. And the second question I would like to ask you, if you are able to comment on that, is the question of development, of international development, but regarding the presence of strong West countries in under intervention in African countries. It's becoming commonplace also in some countries that international development actors are becoming target for some extremist groups and some violent groups that they owe their strength, like you were saying, to these structural problems of the state. And how is the African Union, for example, designing solutions for this like antagonism that is growing with the international development actors in Africa? What are the kind of solutions that they are thinking about? Because it's like a really sad situation that people that the development issue is very complex. Also, there is a lot of political issues at stake. Also, but it's very sad that people that in theory they are committed to African development, they are like becoming the enemies of some Africans. No, not. I don't want to say that they're becoming enemies of the state, but they are like getting some. We are in a very violent context that is affecting these precise kind of factors. So I would like also to thank you once more for your great presentation, and thank you a lot for being with us this morning.
And thank you very much, dear colleague, for your very important questions. Let me start with the second questions about issue of international development. You are right. There are a lot of African countries where you have international presence in terms of providing expertise for development, etc. And it's true that these last years, these international civil servants become a target of some groups. And it's probably because for several decades, in the public opinion, at least in these countries, they consider that these international experts are there to promote the interest of their countries. And it's also because you have a lot of links between foreign countries supporting sometimes authoritarian regime, and there is a negative opinion now, not everywhere in Africa, but in some countries you have a negative opinion about development aid, about humanitarian aid, etc., because people feel that it's a kind of cronyism between elites and international actors. However, the African Union now is trying to provide, and I mentioned the Agenda 2063, the African Union is trying to provide a kind of African solutions. You probably hear that you have a lot of African troops which are involved in peace building issues. So the idea is to have Africa dealing with African problems. And the African, I really believe that it's the best way to provide. Of course, we need to partner with international actors, but the best way to achieve sustainable initiative in terms of development is to have an African solutions for African problems. And it is something very critical. You also raised a key issue in Africa about security, which is the issue of elections. First of all, I would like to clarify the fact that, and you can find in IR literature, how after the end of the Cold War, there was a kind of third wave of democratization that Samuel Huntington, for example, explained in his work. And Africa has been the place where we had a lot of change in terms of democratization. But the issue is that in many African places, the link between democracy and election was so mechanic, and people assume that as far as we have elections, it means that we are a democratic country. The issue is that to have a democratic system, you need to have fair election. If the way you organize election is not fair, then you will have, as Professor Gasquez mentioned, you will have, and you may have turbulence or on a situation of political violence. And this is a key challenge. Election should be organized everywhere in a fair manner, which means that we need to have strong institutions able to supervise, to look at the organization of this election in order to prevent a situation where people are not happy with the result and then started to protest. You mentioned the case of Algeria, which is another situation. Algeria is, and the elites of this country are authoritarian and military elites. And for many decades, they control the country, and the president is almost, how to say, he is in a very weak physical situation, but because there is a system and they want to organize new election to keep this system. And I'm very happy to hear that the youth of this country protested strongly, and now things are changing, I hope. But you are right. Something very key is the way elections are organized in a very fair contest.
I'm afraid we don't have enough time. So the students have any question? No? Well, yeah, some? Okay, please. Could you tell me, could you tell Professor Tequila your name and your question? Very short one, please.
Okay. Hi, my name is Leah, and my question is, how can African governments take these decisions and give answers if you mentioned in the conference that Africa has neither a state or let's say like some kind of identity, African identity. I have this question about the solutions, about the identity of the society in the different countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. I think that identity and beyond the multicultural dimension of an identity in Africa should be not a problem but a strength. And what is, as I mentioned, what is a problem is when some political elites use this contest to achieve their own political goals. And to prevent an identity as potentially the cause of insecurity, we have to develop strong institutions. And strong institutions links to legitimacy of elite. When you have strong institution, and in a democratic system, you have an executive power, legislative power, and everybody has to play a specific role. Then identity should not be a problem. What is important is to have a democratic system with good elections, fair elections, and everybody will agree that if the winner is from this party or this ethnic group, he is the winner. And the challenge here is about legitimacy. If you are legitimate, even if you are from an ethnic group from the north or from the south, from the west, it doesn't matter. It's about how you have been elected and how the state apparatus offers a legitimate framework to deal with a democratic system.
Well, once again, thank you very much, Professor Deguila, for your excellence conference. Please go back to UNAM. Este seminario fue gracias a el apoyo del profesor José Luis Gázquez Iglesias, al Centro de Relaciones Internacionales de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales de la UNAM, el Seminario de Análisis de Coyuntura de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales y al Global South Caucus for International Studies Association. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Buen día. Nos vemos pronto.